32. Evie. It's huge, Evie gasped. Blade turned to her then, a sly smile on his lips. If I had a gold piece for every time, a loud smack wrenched through the air, and Blade winced and clutched the back of his head. The villain didn't even look in Blade's direction as he brought his hand back to his side. It's smaller than the dragon. Her boss had been very quiet since she'd left his office to make sleeping arrangements for everyone. After dismissing the interns and leftover workers to the guest quarters across the courtyard under heavy guard, he'd invited Evie to the back corner of the cellar to see the creature for herself. And the guru was horrifying. Yes, but Fluffy doesn't look like that. Evie tilted her head, and the serpent-like animal angled his head with her. Stop being cute. You're supposed to be a living nightmare. He looked like one, at least, despite the somewhat docile manner with which he was currently conducting himself. His eyes were large and bugging out of his head, which was sloped and tapered at the nose like a snake. When he took a step closer to the bars, his bat wings flared out, the leathery membrane so like the dragon's, and yet different in a way that made her feel intimidated. Why are we keeping this horror show in our cellar again? Evie asked, giving the vicious animal a little wave and gentling her expression when he tilted his head again at her. She turned to get an answer and saw her boss watching her motions carefully, something light in his eyes and a slight upturn of his lips, so small she almost didn't catch it. Sir, something wrong? She asked curiously. He shook his head and cleared his throat, shifting his gaze back to the bars. Ignoring her question, he said, Gurus are notoriously mated animals. And you thought we could assist the creature in the courting department? Blade asked dryly, creeping a hand through the bars, clicking his tongue. Amazingly, the guru crept closer and nudged his head against Blade's hand. How did you do that? Evie's eyes widened. Blade shrugged. Animals like me. Oh, yeah, you're just always in the infirmary. I forget sometimes. Evie hadn't meant the words to sound so insulting, but of course she realized this after they'd already been spoken aloud. To her relief, Blade chuckled and adjusted his vest. It's the less desirable part of the job, to be sure. I would have thought the less desirable part would have been cleaning up the creature's excrement. Blade and Evie both stared at their boss with open mouths. Did he just make a joke? Blade asked her in an exaggerated whisper. She returned her answer at the same volume. I know! He's been doing that a lot lately. Interesting. Do you think? Enough! Their boss put both hands on his hips, looking dark and formidable. If you two don't mind, I'd like to finish what I was saying. Oh, no, Evie said with false innocence. We don't mind. Go ahead. Quirking a brow, seeming to want to smile once more, her boss shook his head and opened his mouth to speak. Guvras are typically mated animals. This particular Guvra's mate is of value to me. Then why not just capture the Guvra's mate? Why go to the trouble of taking this one? Blade began throwing slabs of beef through the bars, and the creature swallowed them without chewing. Because it's nearly impossible to catch a female Guvra. They're too cunning, too smart. The males are far easier to defeat. Besides, this female Guvra is already in captivity. What? Then how do you expect to catch it? Evie asked incredulously. Female Guvras are vengeful creatures, and the best way to capture one is to lure her in with her mate. That doesn't explain how you expect this female to get here if she's being held behind Thars. Do not mistake me. When I say vengeful, I mean it in the most extreme sense of the word. If a female guru believes her mate is in danger, there are no bars in this world that could hold her. A gravity settled over the room, and the only sounds were the hums of the creature beside them. Evie waited for Blade to return to the office upstairs before she walked closer to the cage, pointed an accusing finger at the villain, and whisper shouted, King Benedict! He's the one with the female goober in captivity. Tristan glanced down at her finger and lifted her brow. Very astute, Sage. Why would King Benedict keep a goober? A rolling noise came from the cells, stilling them both. Was that a purr? Evie leaned forward and tentatively reached through the bars as Blade had. A small yelp left her mouth as two large hands wrapped around her middle, yanking her backward. I would prefer you not to lose a hand, Sage. The gravelly voice was in her ear, sending a series of pleasant chills down her spine. He may be cute, as you so eloquently put it, but he has a temper. I think I know someone like that. Evie gazed up at him pointedly, and her boss rolled his eyes. King Benedict has had his mate in his possession for 10 years. 10 years? She exclaimed. What sort of consequences must that have brought? The villain released her with a wry, mysterious grin, then paced away. Regardless, tonight, that will change. The villain always became distant when he spoke of his vengeance, like in order to tap into it, he had to go somewhere else. Somehow Evie knew it was best to leave him alone with it, too. Who was she to stand between a man and his need for retribution? Honestly, if he ever shared his motivations with her, she might even join him with glee. I need to get back to helping with the sleeping arrangements, sir, she said, and ventured back to the stairs of the cellar that would lead her into the office space. She'd nearly made it to the top before the villain's shocked voice carried to her. Sage, did you just call me cute? She opened the door, a grin on her face, but as the heavy metal clanged behind her, a sense of impending doom chased away her good humor, because tonight the villain wouldn't be the only one seeking revenge within these manor walls. If everything went according to plan, a frightening guru was coming for her mate, and not even the villain was going to be able to stop her. Do you want to do your best Steve Irwin for the guru? Um, you don't have to. I was just asking.
Wow,
I was giving you the
beauty.
opportunity.
What a great cobra. Look at it here. Oh, they're the most dangerous creatures and the most territorial in all the world. I'm gonna touch it. Steve, no, don't touch it. You're only gonna upset it. I got it now. Oh, ain't she a beaut?
I just thought you might like the opportunity for that.
It was either that or David Attenborough.
Oh, you want to do David Attenborough next? You want to do one before we start this? There you go.
And here we see the
Hold on, wait. You have to get a bit closer with this one. It's not so loud. Here you go. Take this. Here you go.
And here we see the illustrious and very hidden Louvre. Its mating habits are not quite known to everybody, but we imagine it is very tasteful.
Thank you. Thank you for your spot. Glad I could support you. And
Thank you.
I just like to support your passions.
I love David Attenborough.
I know you do.
Especially the dinosaur special he did. Whoop, whoop.
Dad really likes nature shows in general.
I do. It's called research.
Chapter 33, Evie. It was impossible to focus when one's eyelids had been weighted with lead. Evie pushed them wide with her hands, commanding her body to adhere to her wishes. "You're not going to sleep," she told herself. She'd just gone through her last vanilla candy, a tragedy since she could use the jolt of sugar right about now. The office space was ominously empty, the only sounds the roar of the storm outside. Her father was probably beside himself with worry, but hopefully the missive she was able to send out on one of the ravens made it to him without delay. According to her boss, the storm was plaguing most of the kingdom now. His guards had informed him that everyone was to remain indoors until the storm passed, but it wouldn't. Not until the guru was set free, and that couldn't happen until her boss got what he wanted. The heavenly smell of cauldron brew filled her senses as she looked up to see a steaming chalice placed before her. "You are my favorite person," Evie said before looking up. "Whoever you—" Becky stood there with an equally disgusted expression. Evie shrugged, taking a sip of the warm liquid before pulling the chalice from her lips to stare at it. "Is this poisoned?" "Isn't it a little pointless to ask that after you've already drank it?" Becky asked in confusion. "I needed the caffeine either way. A little poison never killed anybody," Evie said, smiling into her mug when Becky looked frustrated to the point of pain. "It quite literally kills everyone. That's what it's for, you ninny." The woman was almost as literal as the boss. "You bring me brew and then insult me?" Evie put her hand to her chest in mock offense, her words taking a moment to sink in. "Wait, why did you bring me brew?" she asked with a healthy dose of suspicion. "Anyone with eyes could see you were dead on your feet, and if you're determined not to go to the guest quarters like the rest of the workers to wait this out, I would rather not have to listen to you snore while I actually work." Becky returned to her desk across the room, completely ignoring Blade's wave of greeting when he walked past her. Looking a little like a kicked puppy, Blade appeared in front of Evie's desk, dark hair damp from the rain. "It's 6 in the evening. Let's go break into the boss's wine cellar and make a night of it." "You will not be doing that," Becky gasped, standing up, spilling the cup of pencils that was teetering on the edge of her desk. "Have no fear, Becky. I won't drag you into our shenanigans. I know better than to implicate you in any kind of unsanctioned fun." Blade smirked and ducked when Becky chucked one of the pencils at his head, and it knocked into Evie with the eraser side. "Hey!" Evie whipped around to Becky. "Didn't you lecture the boss last week about throwing rocks, you hypocrite?" she grumbled, rubbing at her head, before Tatiana appeared with 2 bottles and 5 glasses. "I've brought wine. Blade, let's drink. You too, Rebecca. I don't want to hear it." Tatiana placed a glass on her desk and filled it to the top. "We can't." Becky stared at the glass like it was filled with actual poison instead of wine. "We can. The workday is technically over, and this wine is from my personal stash," Tatiana said, brushing one of her pink ribbon-tied braids behind her before pouring a glass each for Evie and Blade. Evie accepted hers gratefully and took a bracing sip, feeling the warmth spread down her throat and her aching limbs. "Can you call it my personal stash if it's stolen from my personal stash?" Their boss appeared like an apparition, and while Blade was damp, the villain was soaked to the bone. As was Kingsley, who sat high up on the boss's shoulder, his gold crown dripping and shining like the rest of him. The villain's black shirt clung to every curve of muscle on his torso. Evie gulped as he walked towards her, a thick intensity cloying the air. I told them they shouldn't be drinking, sir, Becky said quickly, knocking her chair over in her haste to stand. Please relax, Miss Erring. I realize being here overnight is an inconvenience I imparted on you all. You may cope accordingly. Their boss looked at Tatiana and the last empty glass. As long as that glass is for me. But of course, Tatiana said jovially, filling it to the brim and handing it to him with a flourish. No sign of the female Guvra? Evie asked, watching her boss down his glass in three long sips, then holding it out for Tatiana to refill. None. He walked towards one of the stained glass windows. Kingsley leaped off his shoulder and onto Evie's desk as he walked past. But I'm not surprised. It'll take time. How will we know when she comes? Becky asked. He turned to the group just as a crack of lightning lit up his face. We'll know, the villain said ominously. Did you plan that? Evie asked, nodding toward the storm. Blade chuckled into his hand, and their boss rolled his eyes at them. You two are incorrigible. I agree, Becky muttered darkly, sending her glass of wine a longing glance. Just drink it, Rebecca. Tatiana walked over, putting the full glass right under her nose. The boss literally told you to relax. Where's your rule-following spirit? It was hard for Evie to tell if Tatiana hated Becky or deeply respected her. Their interactions had always teetered somewhere in the middle. Taking a tentative sip of her glass, followed by a contented sigh, Becky sank farther into her chair. Atta girl. Tatiana gave her an encouraging pat on the shoulder that Becky nudged off while taking another sip of her drink. Careful, lovely Rebecca. Blade raised his glass like he was about to give a toast. You may enjoy yourself, and your body may go into shock. Evie chuckled when Becky lifted her middle finger back to him, making steady eye contact as she drained her glass. Evie saw Blade's throat bob as he tracked the movement. Another bout of lightning struck down, the crashing thunder shattering a window and causing each of them to duck their heads, covering them with their hands. Blade peeked out from under his and frowned at the shattered glass. Who's picking that up? Because all the interns are off for the night, and my fingers are very sensitive. To glass, Tatiana said dryly, pouring more wine for Evie and a slightly dazed-looking Becky. I'll clean it, Evie said. The warmth was beginning to settle in, making her feel lighter, the threads in her chest unraveling. She moved to the closet to grab a dustpan, but was halted by Tatiana, who raised her hand. With a flick of her wrist, the shards of glass lifted and clattered into the trash bin. Blade sighed with a mock frown. I wish I could do that. Tatiana's beautiful smile stretched wide. You have your own special talents, my dear. Yes, like being irritating, Becky added. Or getting injured, Evie giggled. What about his complete lack of self-preservation? Tatiana chuckled, sipping her drink. I don't like this game, Blade said darkly, downing his glass. The color blindness is also something to be admired. All heads turned to look at their boss, who was watching the interaction from just a step away, like he didn't want to fully immerse himself with the living. His wine glass was empty, and Tatiana moved to uncork another bottle to top him off. Blade looked at the villain with betrayed outrage. You too, sir. The boss shrugged, a blank look on his face, making his comment all the funnier for the seriousness with which he delivered it. We could do the boss's talents next. Tatiana looked gleeful, the wine making her eyes brighter, her face glowing. No, you will not. But the boss's voice was drowned out by Evie and Tatiana's tittering. His inability to smile at anything that's not related to death or torture? Tatiana cackled, and Evie laughed with her. She gripped her stomach, tears burning the corners of her eyes. It was the kind of laughter that was difficult to stop, and the more you tried, the more intoxicating the urge became. The best kind. Her favorite. The obsession with his hair, Evie added, wiping her eyes. What about his talent for heaving bodies out of windows? Blade added. Kingsley held up two signs, bad and jokes. Making the interns cry just by looking at them for too long? Becky added quietly, warily. They all laughed even louder, Tatiana tilting her chalice toward the woman in a silent toast. Becky looked around, the smallest, almost indetectable smile appearing on her naturally downturned lips. Evie's laughter finally died down to something more manageable when she looked towards her boss, who was watching them all, watching her with a strange look in his eyes. He was at ease, peaceful. That eternal lock on his jaw seemed to have come loose, and there was a relaxed feeling to him as he said, I am not obsessed with my hair. That was what did it. All of them spiraled into a second, larger wave of hilarity. It was like medicine, healing all the broken pieces and forging them into something new, something different. Belonging was such a foreign concept to Evie, something she quietly longed for, but had never figured out how to achieve. But here it was. Her moment, her people. It was worth the wait. A flash of light and a thunderous boom shook the walls, sucking the levity from the room like a leeching. The villain's jaw went back to its rigidness, and he walked over to look out the window. Sir, not to pressure you, but do you have any idea when the female guru will arrive? Evie asked tentatively, walking up to his side. A piercing screech wrenched the air. Was that? Yes. The villain nodded, keeping his gaze on something outside the window. She's here. All right, what time is it? Where are we?
9:01.
9:01. We got plenty of time. On a roll. Doing stuff today. I'll drink more water. I shouldn't have recorded a bunch of stuff and then done this. I'm very thirsty. I was recording stuff earlier and I was on a roll. Been so productive the last 3 days. Nice. Cleaning my house, recording stuff, editing stuff, taking samples of thunderstorms. I'm very well. But now I'm very thirsty. Talked a lot today. Chapter 34. The Villain. Get back up there! The villain thundered from his sheltered alcove in the courtyard, reeling backward when his assistant appeared behind him with a large net. And what the deadlands is that for? The rain was coming down even harder now, the sounds of the creature's screeches piercing his eardrums. The dragon shuffled his feet in the opposite corner, ducking under one of the large castle archways in the open courtyard. The Gubra hadn't arrived yet, but she was close. Sage appeared beside him in her dress that was so wet from the rain that it was wrapped tightly around her soft curves. It's a net, she yelled back, holding it up and looking at him like he was the one who'd lost his mind. Yes, I've gathered that. It was amazing that even with the roar of a violently dangerous creature heading straight for them, it was this conversation that was giving him the pounding beginnings of a headache. How else are you going to catch it? She said, confused and confusion pinching her thick brows together, a charming crinkle appearing there. And now is certainly not the time for me to notice charming crinkles above my assistant's eyes. I had something a little more concrete planned, he said, gesturing to the open grate on the other side of the courtyard. That leads right into the cellar next to the mail guvra. Will she fly through on her own? Sage asked, a drop of rain trickling enticingly down her cheek. His fingers itched to brush it away. Did I skip the page? I did. He nodded, turning his head back to the sky, waiting. Nothing will keep her from him, remember? Then why hasn't she flown into the hole yet? Sage yelled over the rain that was now coming down impossibly harder than it was before. She's not a fool, he roared back, lightly pulling her arm to bring her back under the eave when she arched her neck out to get a look at the guru. She knows she'd be flying into a trap. She's trying to see if there's another way to get to it. Light flashed in the corner of his vision, followed by more glass shattering. Sage gripped his arm like a vice and used her subtle strength to yank him closer to her, just in time for one of the archways to collapse right where he'd stood, a cloud of debris coming over them. Tristan became unexpectedly aware of his hands, which were somehow on the curve of her hips after Sage had pulled him closer. Feeling himself now breathing heavy for reasons that had nothing to do with his near brush with death, he lifted his gaze from his hands to her lips. She was breathing heavy, too, both her hands gripping his forearms. Thank you, he said finally. His voice had gone embarrassingly hoarse. Another screech snapped him from his bewitchment with her face. Separating awkwardly, he noticed that Sage seemed unshaken by the exchange, which did not bother him in the slightest. Why would being near him have any effect on her at all? Oh, no problem. You getting crushed by a few blocks of cement would have been a very anticlimactic way to go. Have you thought very much about how I would die? He teased, hoping to clear the air of tension with a jest. But as always, his tone was a little off because Sage's eyes widened in offense. Of course not, sir. Sighing and pinching the bridge of his nose, he tried to correct her. Sage, that's not what I. But she surprised him when a mischievous grin overtook her wounded expression. You're so easy. She laughed, another raindrop trailing to the tip of her nose. Mirth climbed into his chest and made a home there as he smiled, wide and free. That is the first time I've ever been accused of that. But the moment was shattered when the roof above them began to crumble. Gripping her damp hand in his, Tristan pulled her along until they narrowly avoided being crushed once more. Now out in the open, wholly exposed, he felt a moment of panic. Go back inside, he ordered Sage. Only if you will, she argued, the outline of her figure clearly visible through her soaked dress. He peeled his eyes up to one of the towers, ordering himself to keep them there. I need to be here to close the grate when she flies inside, he argued. Why can't you have one of your guards do it? She was exasperated, he could tell, because her hands were flying around like a manic butterfly. I will not delegate a task this important. He hadn't done it when catching the mail, and he wouldn't do it now. His plans were just starting to come to fruition, and no doubt the traitor in his office was scrambling along with King Benedict now that Tristan had the upper hand. You are aware that being a control freak is going to kill you, she shouted over the rain, rolling her eyes before they widened in horror. Duck! They both ducked then as a brownish gray blur flew over them, swooping down near their heads. almost knocking them from their necks. This Guvra was as horrifying as he remembered. She was large, larger than the male. She could have shadowed the sun were it making any appearances. She's beautiful, Sage said in awe. She's horrifying, he corrected. Sage shrugged, eyes taking in every gruesome part of the Guvra's body. Oftentimes it's the same thing. He felt his knees bend unwittingly, like his body was attempting to bow. The creature's flight pattern was becoming clear as she moved closer to the grate with every dive. The Guvra would realize soon the only way to be with her mate was to allow herself to be trapped inside with him. When it comes to the thing one loves most, Tristan thought before running out in the open toward the grate, the sounds of Sage's screaming protests behind him. It is always better to be trapped together than free and apart. Time.
909.
Sick. Covering so much ground. Okay. Chapter 35. Evie. What are you doing? Evie screamed into the storm, but there was no way Tristan could hear her above the noise. The Guvra howled when the villain swerved into her line of vision. Evie watched him crouch slowly, picking up the edge of the grate lid, ready to slam it shut at the right moment. A helpless feeling seized the blood in her veins, her stomach bottoming out as she watched the lethal animal dive closer and closer to her boss. The Guvra's taloned feet were splayed and ready to pluck prey from the ground. Evie screamed when the Guvra raked a claw over her boss's shoulder, a bright spray of blood visible despite the murkiness of the rain. To her relief, her boss straightened, seemingly unaffected by the wound, save for a slightly more hunched stance. It's only the venom in their breath that's lethal, she reminded herself. If her boss steered clear of the creature's mouth, he'd live to see another day. And then Evie would pulverize him. Come on, she heard him yell. He's waiting for you. The creature had landed at the top of one of the towers, her slow huffing and stillness casting an eerie calm over the scene. You were too weak to get to him before. Are you still? He was baiting the beast, like she could understand him. Whether she did or not, she was angry, and Evie's boss had grossly miscalculated. She could tell by the flash of panic on his face when the creature flared her wings and opened her mouth wide before going in for one more dive. Her intention was clear. She was going to kill him. Evie didn't think much after that, but she noticed things, of course. Her heartbeat in her ears, her boots beating against the pavement, her dress heavy and wet, making her steps slower. Tristan's eyes, when he looked at Evie's fast approaching form, putting up a staying hand, enraged. The creature closed in, and Evie saw rather than felt her fingers come up to her mouth, and she whistled loudly. Her mind wandered back to her first years in school and how she'd won a contest for being the loudest of all the whistlers. She'd gotten a medal, and now probably all she'd get was sliced in the face by an overgrown flying snake. Adulthood should be illegal. The creature reared up, angling itself at her with the same expression of fury as before, perhaps even angrier. Evie took a slow step backward, then another. Sage! Tristan yelled in her direction. I got it! I got it! She took one more step before swallowing hard. Run! And she did. Through the ruined back archway, and then through the large open doors, around the corner of the entryway, nearly to the stairs, but then a dark shadow came over her, and she realized the steps above her were melting before her eyes, the stone liquefying into a dark goo. Freezing and spinning around, Evie fell to the ground when she realized the creature's head was less than a foot from hers, venomous breath permeating the air, making it difficult for her to breathe. Oh, no, 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 no! She repeated the word like a prayer, like a mantra that this couldn't possibly be happening to her, throwing her hands over her face. Just the touch of the hot, cloying breath skimmed her palms. She screamed. It burned like acid, eating her flesh alive. She prayed she'd pass out soon, as perhaps then she wouldn't have to be fully conscious for her imminent death. Evie cracked her eyes open, noticing a small alcove underneath the stairs. Rolling towards it, she desperately tried to ignore the persistent stinging in her hands the minute they touched the ground. Tucking herself in as small as she could, she hugged her legs to her chest and lowered her chin. The creature screeched again, only this was not the cry of attack, but a wounded sound. It was followed by a loud, creaking thud. Evie carefully untucked herself and moved just her head outside the alcove to see if her suspicions were correct. And they were. Smiling despite the pain she felt, Evie pushed the rest of her body away from the space. The female Guvra lay on her side with her scaly eyelids closed. That took a while. Did you slip on your way in? She asked. Her boss stood there, chest still heaving with the force he'd used on the battering ram that he must have ripped from the wall display. Are you critiquing my rescue? He wiped the water dripping from his forehead and shook out his shirt. No, I'm critiquing the time in which it took you to execute the rescue, she said before narrowing her eyes in realization. And this wasn't even your rescue. It was mine. If I hadn't distracted her, you would have been an evil pancake. He tossed the battering ram aside with the same effort Becky had used to throw her pencil before walking to the female Guvra's side and putting a hand to her neck. She's alive. I just hit a vulnerable point. She'll be up long enough for my guards and me to take her back to the cellar. Are we changing the subject because you're embarrassed that you were an evil overlord in distress? Evie walked to his side, feeling a moment of pity for the felled creature. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Happens to the best of us. I'm not ashamed. It's just untrue. He always played right into her needling, to the point where Evie wondered if he did it on purpose, just to entertain her. But she nixed that theory because really, why would he care about her entertainment? You cannot be an evil overlord in distress, he continued, if you save the hero immediately after she saved you. So, I suppose we saved each other then. Evie smiled, wholly unaware of why the sentence shut something off in her boss's eyes. Head back up to the office. He nodded in the direction of the ruined stairs. I'll take care of this. Oh, God damn it. It's just on the cover. It's fine. Motherfucker. Son of a bitch. Sir? Evie asked. What? The villain said shortly, his eyes finding the ruined stairwell covered in molten liquid. Eyes flashing to the unconscious animal, he muttered, Did she? Yes, sir. Damn it. I'm sure it's fixable, she said, patting his arm. In the meantime, you need to find a way to get this winged lady to the cellar downstairs, and try to stop getting yourself into trouble in the meantime. I can't keep saving you. It was meant to be a joke to lighten the moment, but it sure didn't feel like one when the villain's molten gaze landed on hers. Time?
9:18.
18. Chapter 36. Evie. The storm cleared the next morning, as she suspected it would. The creature's vengeful magic had run dry. He was reunited with his mate, and the clouds had gone. Evie stared at the mirror, seeing herself in a borrowed dress of Tatiana's. It had been a little too large when she'd first put it on, but as soon as the buttons up the back were secured, the bodice slowly tightened around her until the dress fit like a second skin. Well, that's a fun trick, Evie said, inspecting the blue velvet and the large mirror on the other side of the healer's quarters. I got it from a magic dressmaker when I was visiting a friend in Verdelina. Tatiana smiled, walked over, and turned to Evie's hands to inspect under the bandages. All the best magic comes from the South. He said a dress should be worn to fit you, not the other way around. So, no matter what, it always fits like a glove. Tatiana narrowed her eyes, clearly looking at the dark circles underneath Evie's. Did you sleep at all? A little. Your extra bed was comfortable. And it had been. Evie's hands had just ached, even after Tatiana had worked every bit of magic on them. Growing back skin in places where blisters had formed was no small task, and in some areas, Tatiana had admitted they were so badly damaged it would take several magic sessions to fully heal. For those areas, Tatiana applied a salve, but Evie refused a bandage of any sort in case the villain were to notice the damage and ask questions. She'd seen his reactions to her being harmed before, and the last thing Evie wanted or needed was for him to begin to think that she was incapable. So she'd barely slept. Of course, the healer did all that after forcing the entire story out of Evie as payment, including the fact that she'd hidden her ruined hands by some miracle from her boss at the time of the injury. The clanking of glass snapped Evie's attention back to Tatiana, who was already at her work table, crunching leaves and all sorts of funny looking plants into jars. What's it like living with him? Tatiana snorted and continued working, the sun just beginning to come up over the horizon. I wouldn't say I live with him. I only ever see Tristan in the office, or on the rare occasions his wounds need tending, if I desire company. I go to the nearest pub and find myself a beautiful woman to pass the time with. What about Claire? Evie said slyly, ignoring the daggers. Tatiana glared at her over the bowls of herbs. Seemed like things might not be finished there. Oh, they're finished, she grumbled, mashing the herbs harder than before. She made sure of that. I think you'd feel better if you talked about it, Evie said in a sing-song voice, ducking when Tatiana chucked a spoon at her. I deal in secrets, darling. I don't give them away for free. Even to a friend? Evie asked, a little vulnerability slipping through. Tatiana huffed, but then her face softened. Oh dear. We are friends, aren't we? How did I let this happen? Because I'm irresistible. Evie spun around, running her fingers through her hair, laughing when she nearly lost her balance. Ah, yes, that must be it. Tatiana smiled. Well, Evie urged, nodding to the small clock on the table. She still had 20 minutes before the boss would expect his first cauldron brew of the day on his desk, and in truth, she was eager to hear about how the two animals in the cellar were faring. I've got time. It's a long story, Tatiana groaned, like talking about her personal life was an offense against her character. The short version is, I grew up down the road from the three Maverine siblings. Claire and I were inseparable ever since we were children. Evie's eyes widened, both delighted and a little flabbergasted at what this development meant. Does that mean you knew the villain? I mean, Tristan. She didn't know why, but she'd never once thought of her boss as anything other than being born fully grown. Yes, I knew Tristan since we were very young. Tatiana shifted, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable in her own skin, like she was unsure of herself. It's not really something I should be talking about with you. Sighing and dragging a chair closer to sit right across from the healer, Evie said, how many of my secrets do you know? You get hurt a lot, so many, she said apprehensively. So, Evie pressed, don't you think you owe me at least one friend? She said the last word with wounded innocence in her eyes. Tatiana groaned again and put her head in her hands. You are a conniving little manipulator. She pulled her head up, looking at Evie with a disbelieving smile. You've been here too long. Ah, please, we're just getting to the good part. Evie grinned, leaning forward, and gestured for Tatiana to continue. What do you want to know? A wicked look crossed the healer's face, followed by a quirk of her brow. Why do you want to know? The quickening beat of Evie's heart was certainly just because it made her uncomfortable to be scrutinized so directly. Who wouldn't? Evie rationalized. It's hard to picture that man as anything but that, man. Why is it suddenly so hot in here? She stood up and walked toward the windows, pushing out one until fresh, cool air brushed against her warm cheeks. I mean, was he always so? She weighed her words before turning back to Tatiana, who finished for her. Bored, brooding, grumpy, terrible at feeling and exhibiting normal human emotions? Yes, Evie nodded. To which? Tatiana asked, a confused look passing over her face. Yes, Evie repeated flatly. Standing up from her chair, Tatiana walked toward the door of the quarters. If you must know anything, no, he was hard to read, even then. He always kept to himself, always doing his best to keep any attention off of him. Evie stared, absorbing every word like precious nutrients as the healer continued. He had a quiet kindness to him, though. Tatiana smiled then. He never was around much when I would come to be the Claire. He was a few years older, so I always thought it was because he didn't want two annoying little girls bothering him. What? Evie asked, sensing the word before it was spoken. But on my 10th birthday, my mother had a party for me. My healing magic had shown up a year before when I'd nearly been crushed by a passing carriage. Everyone was thrilled. They thought I could be a core healer. Evie couldn't believe the absurdity because, from her meager understanding, core healers were so rare they were practically myth. It was normal for magic to be ignited in someone by something painful, but very rare for that person to have healer's magic, much less core magic. But that was what core healers were. They could heal minds, bodies. Some said they could heal your very soul to your core. A myth, she thought. Tatiana continued. Claire and Malcolm were my dearest friends, but it suddenly felt like I was a toy everyone wanted to play with. My mother had made my party an open invitation, so hundreds of people were there to witness my magic being born. It was terrible. I was dragged around by my arm throughout the entire party, people asking me to heal cuts, bruises, even dire sicknesses. I hadn't seen a specialist yet, so I had no idea really what I was doing or the cost. I was only 10. There was a moment in her words where Tatiana began to look like the little girl from her story, lost and overwhelmed. That's terrible, Tati. Evie wanted to hug her friend, but she continued her story like Evie's words hadn't registered. It was this birthday that showed me that no matter what I accomplished in life, from that day on, I would always be defined by this one singular ability. Nobody would ever see me. When the party ended, I wanted to cry. I didn't even get a piece of my own cake. But Claire and Malcolm stayed behind to celebrate with just me. For me. The sadness on the healer's face slowly shifted into mirth as one corner of her mouth tilted up. We had fun, but they couldn't dispel the heaviness in my heart no matter how hard they tried. She looked at Evie, then, her remarkable brown eyes glittering with a grace so humbling Evie could only stare in awe. And then Tristan arrived. This snapped Evie from her near worship. He came to your birthday? I was as surprised as you. The healer shook her head and rubbed her arm. He hadn't attended any of my other birthdays, but he came immediately after everyone left. He baked a cake. He baked? I know. But he was always fond of it. Edwin used to teach him how. Tatiana chuckled. Our Edwin! Evie didn't realize the ogre's history with the villain went back that far. He was our village's Edwin first, ran the bakery. Was usually who Tristan spent most of his time with. He didn't like being around the rest of the family. Tatiana shook her head. I understand why he keeps him here. Edwin was the only one who... Clearing her throat, Tatiana dropped the words like she'd never said them and continued her 10th birthday story. Anyway, Tristan stayed the whole time. He even sang when we lit the birthday candles. Very off-key, I might add. I would sell my soul to see that, Evie said with a deadpan expression. The healer laughed. He told me that the opinions of others are ever-changing and to never care quite so much of the world's perception of you. Tatiana stood there looking the same as she always did, beautiful and emboldened, but now she had a subtle glow to her that wasn't there moments before. He never brought it up again. It was one of the kindest and most thoughtful things anyone had ever done for me. But the next day, he was back to his quiet gruffness, like it never happened, like he didn't want to be acknowledged for an act of true goodness. That hadn't changed much, Evie supposed. She knew her boss repelled praise like it was claws against the skin. What happened after that? Tatiana beamed, her arms going wide and warmth spread in Evie's chest. I decided, after that birthday, that if someone was going to pick one thing about me to notice, I would get to choose what it would be. It's 32. Slow realization dawned as Evie looked up with wide eyes, noting the bright pink ribbon around Tatiana's wrist. The pink! She nodded, gesturing to the worn cloth. I bought my first pink bow the next day, and it's been my comfort ever since. Well, it looks wonderful on you, so that worked out rather nicely, Evie said before asking hesitantly. And what happened with Claire? Tatiana's eyes shuddered. All I will say is Claire never forgave Tristan for the events that turned him into the villain, and I did. It wasn't a problem in the beginning, but it became one. And then it was over. I'm sorry, Evie said gently. The healer patted her on the shoulder and smiled tightly. Let me get to work, my friend. We can't keep the villain waiting. Chapter 37. Evie. One of the maps is missing from the cartography closet. Evie's boss didn't even bother to look up from his own maps strewn haphazardly across the table in the small alcove at the end of the hall. Could it be because I am holding a few of them? He asked dryly, still not looking up. Rude. No, smartass. It's one of the maps that details the Valiant Guard's regular routes into the city. It's not there. Someone took it. When she'd seen her boss coming out with a handful of maps that morning, an idea sparked. The villain was getting hit through his shipments, so if any of the maps weren't accounted for. And they weren't. Evie had spent her entire morning scouring the closet, checking each one off as she went until one box was left unchecked. He finally looked up, brow furrowed. I don't understand. You need a key to get into that closet, and the only people who have one are you and me. Evie placed her hands on her hips and glared. What are you implying? Be calm, little tornado. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. His use of the nickname made her raised shoulders relax. I have my key here. Where's yours? Evie pulled it from the pocket of her skirts and held it up, twirling it between her fingers. And the lock wasn't broken. Could it have been picked? The villain shook his head, standing up from the chair he'd been sitting in. That lock is unpickable. It's warded with magic. He paused, his face going white. What? Evie practically yelled. There was a third key, he said, squeezing his eyes shut and pinching the bridge of his nose. Evie waited for him to continue, feeling as if she were about to spring outside of her skin. But he didn't speak, just stood there, not moving an inch. She waited one more beat before speaking, because really, this wasn't a melodrama. Hello? Who has it? He shook his head. It matters not. When she started to argue, he held out his hand. Believe me, Sage, let it go. Because she was so very good at doing that, but she obliged anyway, for now. She was tired more than she was curious, and that was jarring enough that Evie took a step back. It was nearing late afternoon, and she needed to go home. Needed to let family know she was well and assure that Lissa was still being taken care of, despite how much better their father was doing over the past few months. Shaking her head, she held up her hands in surrender. Sir, I'm exhausted. I need to go home. Make sure it's still standing and all that, and then I need to take a nap, preferably with a toasty fire in the fireplace and the pitter-patter of rain against my roof. The surprise on his face melted into what almost appeared to be concern, but every reaction was always such a subtle shift of emotion, it was next to impossible to interpret some days. Yes, I suppose we can continue this the day after tomorrow. There was no way to tell by his voice if he was angry or upset. It was too even and almost practiced, sort of steady. I was going to announce at closing time that everyone has the day off tomorrow. Evie blinked. But it's the middle of the week. Why? Until we find the person giving away our secrets, I'd like to have the office formally searched without anyone here to interfere. If the spy left even a scrap of a clue, I want to find it before they have a chance to get rid of it. She nodded and scanned the lines of stress across his face. He probably needed a nap as well, but that was hardly her concern. I'll see you the day after tomorrow, I suppose. Actually, Sage, now that I've considered it, you're not getting the day off. I need your help in the search. Evie frowned, her brows furrowing as she said, Why am I being punished because someone is trying to blow you up? The villain lifted a brow, ready to respond, but his head whipped to the side. The sounds of whispered giggles came down the hall, and both Evie and the villain waited for a moment so they could greet the two wanderers, until the echo of two voices reached them. One most likely a man, and the other a woman. I wonder if the boss will give a reward to anyone who knows information regarding the mole. Evie could tell by the tone that it was one of her least favorite interns. He might, but Evie didn't hear the rest, because in her panic she'd thrown open a panel of the wall that lay before one of the hidden rooms and threw her boss, who was apparently so shocked that Evie touched his person that he moved without protest inside with her. The space was not made for two people. In fact, it was hardly fit for one. Evie's entire body was pressed tightly against her boss's, his low voice hissing in her ear. Why the deadlands did you do that? He grumbled under his breath. Little tornado. Hey, she warned, ignoring how close together their faces were. That time, little tornado sounded like an insult. When were you under the illusion it was a compliment? He whispered back incredulously. She held up a hand to silence him and nodded toward the wall. Muffled words were being spoken, but Evie couldn't quite make them out. Pressing her ear against the cold stone panel, she squeaked when the wall gave a little under the gentle pressure of her head. Before she could fall through it, making an absolute ass of herself, strong hands wrapped around her waist, bringing her back into him. The wall stopped moving, and the continued conversation flitted through the crack, thankfully distracting her from the large male body pressed against hers. Whoever's screwing the villain over better be counting their calendar days. Ooh, I'm about to lose my boat now. Did you see the way he carried Miss Sage in after the klutz almost got herself killed? If I knew being a charity case was all it took to get the villain's attention, I would have made up a far better sob story in my application letter. A cruel laugh followed the words, and Evie felt a numbness settle over her. It was freeing, in a way, though words such as those did not sting and fell her the way they used to. Despite her many moments of doubt, Evie knew who she was. She didn't always get things right, but she worked hard, and she always kept trying, even when she failed. Those were good things to be, good things to have around. And if Evie was able to choke down one more breath, perhaps she'd begin to believe that was true. Sage, the villain whispered. Shh, she shushed back, turning toward him and pointing her finger to the door. Listen, she mouthed at him. It has to be someone higher up in the company, the man said. Oh, most certainly. I'm sure the boss already knows who it is. He's just getting the full time to sweat while he comes up with a perfect plan to dispatch them. Evie felt his hands tighten on her waist ever so slightly. She wondered if he was trying to figure out a polite way to get past her, but his fist tightened at the mention of his team. He was getting angry. She couldn't see his face, but there was a palpable energy in the air. Could you imagine if it was Evangelina? The male voice said, and they both cackled at that. Evie's clenched Evie clenched her fist so hard she thought her bones might crack. As if that woman is capable of any kind of deception. She looks like she'd get lost in her own home. Embarrassed heat flooded her cheeks as she remembered who was currently pressed up against her, and how her boss was now hearing what the staff really thought of his assistant. It occurred to her that many people would love to be in her position as the fly on the wall, getting to hear the words people spoke of you when you weren't around to defend yourself. But as it turned out, it was awful, absolutely horrendous. What a wonderful day I have. I'm going to. Evie whirled around, which caused her shoulder to graze the villain's chest in the cramped area, and put her small hand over her boss's mouth before he could say another word. "You're not going to do anything," she whispered. "Now hush, or we might miss something important." It was quite literally torture to hear every disparaging word, but they'd stand here and listen if it meant saving Tristan's life. Evie couldn't explain it, but she had the strong feeling something important was about to happen, like a large object was hovering overhead waiting to drop. She just hoped they weren't standing under it when it fell. "Did you hear what the other interns were saying?" The woman's voice was haughty. "No, what?" "They found a mask with King Benedict's emblem on it in a corner of the stairwell the day of the explosion." "What?" the male voice said, astonished. "Why didn't anyone report it to the boss?" "My guess is they didn't want to give it to him and then be deemed as a suspect for coming across it in the first place." "Makes sense," the male voice chuckled. "Have you seen the way the man handles slights against him? Look at what he did to Joshua Lightenston." "Oh no!" The female's voice became a conniving whisper. "I heard he did that because of what Joshua said about Miss Sage." Evie narrowed her eyes at the villain, who'd gone rigid underneath her hand, black eyes looking everywhere but at her. "We better stop this, Celine, unless we want to be next." "All hail saintly Miss Sage!" Celine chuckled as their footsteps faded into the distance. Evie realized her hand was still over the villain's mouth, his soft lips a soothing contrast to the stubble tickling her fingers. Dropping her hand back to her side, Evie awkwardly apologized. "Sorry, sir." Then she quickly shoved the hidden door back open and stumbled into the light, a burning sensation prickling along her skin. "Is your hand bleeding?" His already low voice seemed to have dropped an octave. When Evie turned back to address his question, she enjoyed the sight of his back muscles stretching his shirt as he pushed the heavy wall panel closed. "Ahem," she mumbled, looking down to see her nails had scraped one of the blisters that still remained on her palm. "Oh, look at that. I suppose it is." "Is it from the burns you got last night?" He said it so casually, Evie nearly missed the implication of the sentence. She exhaled hard, taking a step backward to have a better look at him. "How did you know about that? Did Tatiana rat me out?" The villain rolled his eyes, moving back to the table where his maps were. He took a seat and picked up the charcoal pencil. "Hardly. Tatiana is a vault. I knew about your hands last night." Evie was confused and tired, and still a little wounded from being raked over the coals just now by people who were meant to respect her. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you were quite obviously trying to hide it. I didn't see a need to draw attention to it against your wishes." He kept looking down, his voice about as emotionless as a brick. Well, Evie seemed to have enough emotions for them both. "Well, it's not from the burns." "Not exactly," she grumbled. "I squeeze my palms too hard, which happens sometimes when I'm feeling stressed." This caused him to jerk his head up and look at her too directly. "Because of what those nitwits said?" He looked into the direction they had walked, back to the office space. "I prefer the word nincompoops," Evie said thoughtfully. "Why?" The villain angled his head at her. "Because it sounds funnier." He sighed like he was exhausted. I don't have a response to that. Excellent, she nodded, itching to leave before his scrutinizing gaze burned a hole through her. But something occurred to her that gave her enough courage to look right at him as she asked, what did Joshua Lightenston say about it? Evie tried not to flinch when his eyes darted away from hers and found something interesting out the window beside the table. I don't recall. You don't recall, Evie said skeptically. You, who recalled during an inventory the other day that you'd only fired 7 arrows at some night last year, can't remember what an intern said a few weeks ago? She watched the villain clench his jaw, and suddenly she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her, because whatever was said about her, it must be unbelievably bad if even someone with an evil as hard as Tristan couldn't bear to repeat it. Never mind, Evie said quickly, her stomach twisting. I really don't want to know. He sighed. Joshua Lightenston was impertinent. Let's leave it at that, Sage. All right, Evie swallowed, wringing her hands together. That's it. He looked at her suspiciously, and his knowledge of her notorious stubborn streak sent a pang of familiar comfort through her. That's it, Evie offered, what she hoped was a convincing smile. This wasn't the first time someone had said something mean about her. It certainly wouldn't be the last. I'm tired, sir. I think I'll head home. All of a sudden, the exhaustion from the last several days nearly buckled her knees. The Guvra, her injuries, the gossip, it all just seemed too much. And she wanted to go home, to go to sleep. As if to prove her point, a large yawn escaped her mouth as she rushed to cover it with her palm. I'll take you home, he said, stretching his shoulders. That's not necessary, sir, Evie said, feeling herself sway from the exhaustion. He put a hand on her arm to steady her. Yes, it is. As he gathered his maps and guided her away, Evie couldn't help but remember why she'd sought him out in the first place. Someone had stolen a map, and Tristan knew who it was. Time?
It is 9:51.
Right on time.
Nice.
So sad. Okay.
What was that chapter?
It was 32 through 37.
Just wanted to let Emmy.
Say what?
I just wanted to let Emmy know.
Of course. Well, thank you all for joining me. I'm gonna try and be more regular. I swear, I'm trying my best. A lot has happened. Big upheavals, but thank you for being patient with the uploads while I take care of some life stuff. Really appreciate it. My whole sleep schedule's changed, and I don't know how to function. So, it's much appreciated. Thank you guys.